covers the rise of Peter Thiel in Silicon Valley, and to a larger extent, kind of the rise of Silicon Valley itself as a power base. If you turn back the clock, 15 years ago or so, or over the last couple of decades, Thiel has played this, kind of incredible behind the scenes role, in the tech industry as, the first outside investor in Facebook, kind of the guy who really first, was the one to believe in Mark Zuckerberg, as well as the leader, the de facto leader of this group called the PayPal Mafia, which is this sort of unofficial network of very influential techies that it also includes the founders of YouTube, Yelp. It includes Elon Musk. It includes Reid Hoffman, and he's just been responsible for a huge amount of the development of Silicon Valley over the last couple of decades. Now, that would all, I think, totally justify, doing a book like the one I wrote about him. But it's actually more interesting than that because, starting in 2016, Thiel really started to step out as this political figure, as one of the most prominent and important supporters of Donald Trump. In May 2016, he shows up on the list of delegates for the Republican National Convention, gives a speech endorsing Trump that's pretty well received, standing ovation, and then donates a huge sum of money just before Election Day and plays this really, I think, pivotal role both in the election of Trump and then also in the early days of the Trump administration. And so I think those two things together, make for a really interesting story because you have both the Silicon Valley power story, which I think has been going on and is going to continue to go on, and also this political story, which is, major Silicon Valley figure, getting involved in this kind of really interesting and unexpected political development in the United States.
Yeah, you mentioned the political side of it, which might have brought his name to a broader audience than the Valley. But even within the Valley, as you were saying, there's a lot of bigger, more well-known names. You mentioned Zuckerberg, there's Bezos, there's Musk. But you say they're really the true idol of Silicon Valley. Can you explain that part before we jump into the political side?
Yeah, of course. And so there are other figures, like you said, that are maybe better known or richer, or have also have followings. Musk, Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg. But the thing is that what makes Thiel so interesting is not just the money or the fact that he is a very successful investor. He has made a great deal of money, but he's had this kind of very super important cultural influence, and that's the thing that I think is probably overlooked, and that's where his impact maybe starts to overshadow the impact of even some of those better known figures. So I'm talking about kind of the way that Silicon Valley companies do business. This kind of growth, this hyper growth impulse that we've seen play out, over and over again. First with Facebook, then with Uber, then with all of these SoftBank companies. We see it in the ethos of disruption. We see it in this idea of founders being this kind of privileged class of citizen who are not only privileged, as just as sort of seen as special people, but have more rights than the average investor. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg having these super voting shares, and that's something that Thiel set up, and that has, of course, spread widely. So this is a guy who is, yes, a behind the scenes player, but he also has like a huge following. He's exceedingly influential among the people who actually do stuff in tech every day.
Something I was interested in your book was there's this mystique around being a founder, being a coder, kind of rolling your sleeves up and starting from the beginning, and then if you're lucky, riding that to the stratosphere. But Thiel himself isn't a coder. He doesn't really get his hands dirty with these kind of things. What is he bringing to the table that's bringing him this much success so many times, so broadly?
Well, yeah, I mean, he doesn't have any particular, tech expertise. Of course, now he's been in the industry for a long time, and I think that's really interesting, and it raises a lot of kind of cool questions. I mean, so what he brings to the table is, he's very good at kind of like predicting the future, and that's one reason I think it's worth kind of paying attention to him. He's also very good at the kind of chess moves of business, of the kind of how do you sort of both as maybe as a leader, kind of conventional sort of he's an unconventional manager, but has been successful at times. But also just as somebody who can kind of knows how to move the pieces on the chessboard to get what he wants. There aren't that many business people who've kind of gone toe to toe with Elon Musk and come out ahead. And I think Thiel's one of those, right? Thiel, during the early years of PayPal, led a coup where he bested Elon Musk, got him tossed out of the company in this totally, kind of cold-blooded, Machiavellian fashion, and somehow managed not only to become CEO of PayPal, but sort of managed to keep that connection with Elon Musk. And that is kind of an amazing instance of sort of Machiavellian gamesmanship. And you see that over and over again with Peter Thiel. And I would argue you saw it during the Trump administration. I think he played that pretty well, just from a sort of tactical and gamesmanship perspective. Maybe if not, there's going to be a lot of disagreement about whether he played it well from a political perspective or from an ideological perspective.
Yeah, you mentioned the Musk relationship. I thought that was really interesting too. I mean, there was enough drama just in that relationship to probably create its own miniseries at some point. And as you note, they're still colleagues in some degrees today. How is he able to maintain those relationships with people even after they square off in pretty public ways?
Well, I think okay, so I think it's a couple of things. I think one is Thiel is somebody who, gets a charge from sort of disagreeing with people, from being controversial, and so in some ways, that's like just how he relates to the world. I also think that it's a reflection of his power. As I said, this group, the PayPal Mafia, which includes these incredibly successful business people, they are able to kind of move money around to kind of act as kingmakers, both in terms of financing startups, but also giving jobs to promising young people, and they've created this following where there's a lot of power there. And I think so I think there's, to some extent, there's a friendship, although it's maybe more of a frenemy-ship, and there's also a power relationship where both of these men who are very powerful kind of need each other, and they need each other more than they want to fight with each other.
If you're just joining us now, we're talking with Max Chafkin. He is the author of The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power. I believe it's just out this week, Max, right? I've got a copy here.
Great. Yeah, it came out a couple days ago. You can pick it up anywhere books are sold.
Good plug. You mentioned the future in your last response that Thiel is pretty good at looking into the future in his crystal ball, so to speak. You wrote in the book how he foresaw the college tuition bubble, protests against Google monopolies. What do you think he's agitating for now? What do we have to look out for that he might be interested in now that could be
Well,
foreshadowing something to come?
So there are a few things that I think are worth paying attention to. One is crypto. Thiel is, I think, in some sense, the ideological kind of godfather of crypto. Back in the day, back in the early years of PayPal, Thiel. So we think of PayPal as just being this amazing, money transfer thing. It's like Visa, but on the internet, which of course it is. But it was also, and really importantly, part of this kind of libertarian project that is a big part of Peter Thiel's, political ideology. There are interviews from the late 90s where Thiel talks about PayPal in these kind of revolutionary terms. This is going to be something that's going to go beyond the nation state. It's going to allow people in repressive countries, countries where they have currency controls, to get around those controls. It's going to be a Swiss bank account in your pocket, which is like a really kind of radical thing, right, for a CEO to say. We normally most people are sort of somewhat skeptical of, the kind of extreme privacy. There's a lot of complaints about, money laundering, weapons trafficking, et cetera, when you get into banking privacy. And I think that's important because that ideology, of course, transfers almost mapped perfectly to crypto, where like you hear crypto heads kind of talk about it in almost the exact same terms. And I think there's an ideological debt there, and it's definitely part of Thiel's kind of libertarian worldview. And you're seeing him make investments both directly in crypto and also in kind of crypto companies that are kind of catering to this world. So that's one thing. I think the other thing that's worth paying attention to super closely is Thiel as a political actor, and that exists on a couple of different dimensions. One of which you hinted at, which is Google, right? He's been leading this kind of, at times, overt and at times, somewhat, I would argue, somewhat covert campaign to bring scrutiny to Google, whether it's scrutiny over Google's supposed connections with the Chinese government, scrutiny over Google's supposed having a monopoly, and he's been super critical, and that of course serves multiple functions. I think probably on some level the criticism is it reflects his true beliefs, right? He's somebody who, despite having been a big tech investor, is has been critical of tech power, but it's also from a sort of purely tactical perspective, a great way to take some of the heat off of Facebook, where he's still on the board. Google also, competes for government contracts with Palantir, where Peter Thiel, is a co-founder and owns a ton of stock still. He's, the biggest shareholder of Palantir. So that's a political thing that serves a business end. There's also another political thing where Thiel, post 2020 is backing these kind of hard right populist nationalists, a couple of Senate candidates, J.D. Vance and Blake Masters, who are running more or less to be, the heirs to the Trump movement. So the thing that people in the Thiel circles talk about a lot is kind of Trumpism beyond Trump, or Trumpism without Trump. And I think Thiel is making a very explicit play to be kind of the patron to that movement, to play the role, that the Koch brothers played for a long time in kind of mainstream Republican politics, but in this kind of Trumpist political movement that is still going on. And I think in some parts of the country, at least, is still gaining strength.
Back to Facebook for a moment. I know from reading the book that Thiel's still a big mentor to Zuckerberg, despite some, as it seems to be common with him, some frictions along the way. And now you have Facebook trying to mint its own coin, going back to what you're saying about crypto and his ideas about kind of perhaps destabilizing things. Where do you see that influence going with that project?
Well, I think, Zuckerberg has talked at some length about Thiel's influence on him from a business perspective, as having an influence on the way that Zuckerberg built the business. And I think when you look at kind of the sort of Peter Thiel business worldview, which is, reflected in a book that, basically every Silicon Valley entrepreneur reads, it's called 0 to 1, like you really see a lot of parallels there. I think Thiel has had an underappreciated influence in terms of Zuckerberg's kind of political and ideological outlook. Zuckerberg, while he during the Obama years kind of styled himself as a sort of centrist technocrat type, maybe not surprisingly, there are definitely like libertarian threads that run through Facebook, both in terms of their kind of approach to speech and their refusal to really crack down in a big way on things like misinformation and lies in political ads. And it also plays out in this currency project, which of course has business implications for Facebook. And if they are able to develop this kind of crypto payment system, obviously that could be really good for the company and make digital commerce, frictionless and do lots of things for Mark Zuckerberg. But of course, it's also kind of a continuation of this libertarian vision of this idea of taking power away from nation states. And people often observe that Facebook in some ways has more power than a country. It's kind of run like a country, or maybe it's run like the UN. And I think there is this extent to which the Facebook project, is about transcending these national borders, and that includes, aspects of social networking, but also, of course, currency is a big way that that governments, regulate their countries, and this would, at the very least, complicate it. And I think that's why regulators have scrutinized it, a great deal, and probably will continue to scrutinize it.
Where do you think Thiel has the best chance at realizing his vision? Is it through increased or prolonged influence over Facebook and where that's going, given its complete global reach? Is it he's still got a hand in the politics bucket, at least here domestically? Which is it a race to his ultimate vision?
I mean, I think Thiel, I think the Koch comparison is helpful because the Koch approach is kind of like, it's part business and part politics, right? There's a company and a political program, and the political program kind of advances the interests of the company, and the company feeds into the political interest. And I think with Thiel, it's pretty similar. There's a political project, which is this kind of promotion of sort of hard right and at times libertarian values. And right now it consists of kind of embracing this Trump movement, which I think actually has a lot of potential for him in terms of like playing the influence game. And then there is, a business project, and that business project is about, growing his growing his bankroll, and also, bringing new technologies to the world. And you got to remember, Thiel comes out of the hedge fund world, right? He's very different from a lot of technologists, in the sense that he is not somebody who bets it all on black, or whatever, on red. That's a bit of the Elon Musk approach. Thiel is somebody who's always trading, who's trading ideas, who's trading companies, and I think so this is always going to be the case. He's going to be trying to find the next trend. Right now maybe that's crypto, also defense. He's got a lot of defense investments. So I think it's like he's worth watching, because if you watch what he's doing, you get a little sneak peek into the future.
Hmm.
And of course he's very smart at kind of optimizing for his own success, whether that's technological or political.
Mm. I've got a question here from a stream. Daniel wants to know, Max, did you have a chance to talk to or interview Teal for the book? And if not, did he have any reaction to the book so
Yeah,
far?
of course. So I approached this, there is a lot, like a huge body of output already on Peter Thiel. And to me, that was part of the attraction of the project, because there is on the left, Thiel is seen as this kind of supervillain. On the right, he's seen as a superhero. It's like he's like, an Ayn Randian hero who's, speaking truth to power, and making the future happen. And I was trying to kind of come somewhere down the middle, right? Cut through both of those myths, which both contain, of course, hints of truth, but are not the whole story. And so I, very early on, when I was reporting this book, approached Peter Thiel, and had conversations, ongoing with his team while I was reporting the book, which included, interviews with more than 150 sources who were, in one way or another, closely connected to Peter Thiel, friends, former classmates, people who work for him, people who work at his investment firms, and so on. Thiel, kind of engaged, and I met with him off the record, but he did not participate. He did not speak to me on the record. At the end of the process, we put forward a huge, list of fact-checking questions, which is kind of like the standard kind of journalistic approach. They listened, and did not, respond in any way. I think we've seen, after the books come out, he hasn't spoken to me directly, but I've gotten hints that he's seen it, or had, at least at the very least, had the book described to him, or summarized, or something like that. And has issues with it, as of course you'd expect, for when it's a book that is, like I said, not embracing the kind of like the mythology. But I think what I think is that, number one, there's a lot of part of what I wanted to do is, like I said, go beyond the mythology. People have access to Peter Thiel's thoughts, right? Like he's written a very good book that people can buy, and will summarize his ideas. There are YouTube speeches. I went really deep in his writing and his speaking. But what I wanted to do is actually understand what's behind the scenes. And to some extent,
Mhm.
you can't understand that by just asking somebody. Like, if you say, hey, how did you make this happen? Or, why is it that you're so powerful? A lot of times people either, number one, don't have a good answer, or number two, don't want to tell you, because like that's kind of like the secret sauce. So that's kind of where the book landed. And I think in some ways it's probably a better book for that.
Mm. You just talked about some of the body of work that he has out there that's influencing folks. We've talked about him being a real mentor to Zuckerberg and other names that we've heard. But what about the next generation? I think, what do you think that they're going to glean from this? You're mentioning YouTube lectures and books, et cetera. We've kind of seen the first gen play out on this. Do you think it's going to be any different for this next class, so to speak, of entrepreneurs and builders, as I believe he calls them, coming up in the Valley and elsewhere?
Well, I mean, I think it's still playing out. I mean, Thiel has run this fellowship, the Thiel Fellowship, for about 10 years, and it's basically they give $100,000 to very young people to drop out of college. It was originally, you had to be under 20. They've raised it a little bit because they had kind of had trouble in the early years. But of course, that is like a powerful kind of way to kind of create that next generation. I mean, and to increase, to sort of power that influence network, which is real, and it's definitely not shrinking. I mean, the other thing about this, and what I find just super interesting about this stuff. So like I'm friends, and my colleague and friend Ashley Vance, who works at Bloomberg, and he wrote a biography of Elon Musk that I love. And in that book, Musk is in every scene, right? He's like pressing the button. He's he's like
Hosting Saturday Night Live.
He's scrutinized, and I've been in meetings with Elon Musk too. He scrutinizes everything, right? He wants to make the final decision on the bolt that goes into the left, wing nut on the, right flank of the, sideways part on the rocket, whatever. And
maybe more of the Steve Jobs school of leadership,
or even more extreme, I think. And Thiel is the opposite, right? He is somebody whose power is a kind of quiet power, but that also is power, and it can be also very interesting. The one of the interesting things about this is, like, once you have a certain amount of money and you've created a reputation for, say, contributing to political causes that you're allied with, or funding like-minded founders, you get to this point where you don't actually have to tell people to do things, right? Because you create these incentives that cause them to do it for you. And I think that to some extent is kind of the key to understanding, Peter Thiel's power. This is not somebody who's in the room. He's somebody who creates the conditions. And in that sense, of course, the PayPal mafia, to call it a mafia is a cliche, and it's a little bit misleading, because it's not a, mafias are violent networks, and that's not what this is. But one way it is helpful is, mafias work in these indirect ways. And I think that is very much the case with Peter Thiel, and with actually, honestly, how a lot of the influence in Silicon Valley works. If you want to get a really good job in Silicon Valley, one way to do it is to court this world by expressing similar ideology, similar ideas about the future, and praise for their companies. And that cuts against, I think, a lot of the mythology of Silicon Valley, which sort of says, oh, it's this amazing meritocracy, marketplace of ideas, which it is to some extent. But of course, expressing loyalty is its own path to success for a lot of people.
Let's pull that thread of indirect influence a little bit for a moment. You've written about one of Thiel's favorite tax loopholes that has something to do with this indirect influence over some of the companies he's involved with. Can you tell us about that? I know it's something we've been writing about on Bloomberg. It's got a lot of interest about how the wealthier may be skipping out on some taxes through this method.
Yeah, so Thiel was a pioneer of a structure that is, important to say, totally legal, where basically founders of private companies put shares of startups, which cost very little money when the startup is founded, inside of a Roth IRA. Now, Roth IRAs were created in the 90s as a kind of lower middle class retirement savings account. There's a limit that's relatively low. I think it was $2,000 when Thiel began contributing to it. It's $6,000 now. There are income limits. If you make more than a certain amount of money, you cannot contribute to a Roth IRA. And what Thiel was able to do, basically, is put a bunch of PayPal shares, very early PayPal shares, into his Roth IRA. And once you do that, it's any gains, any income there is tax-free. So that money has grown, and that then sort of rolled into other investments, early investment in Palantir, early investment in Facebook. One of the greatest, venture capital investments of all time was made inside of this structure. And what that means is that, Thiel now has a Roth IRA that is in the billions of dollars, at least $5 billion as of 2019. When you look at where the stock market has gone since then, and the market in general for private companies, it's probably substantially higher now. And so he has managed to, avoid a tax bill that could in theory be in the billions of dollars. Now, that's controversial because of course, like, this lower middle class structure is now being exploited by billionaires. Of course, some people, like it. They think, and I think if you pin Thiel down and asked him about it, he would defend it as a legal use of the tax code, and also because he's not somebody who's in favor of higher taxes. He's somebody who thinks that billionaires should pay fewer taxes, and that the reach of the state is too much. So there's that. There is, though, the prospect that the rules could change, and in particular, because these tech guys have been very, very aggressive in their, in their use of this in terms of buying shares of their own companies, which is technically okay, because you're not allowed to buy shares in a thing that you control. And a lot of these guys were buying shares in companies that they didn't technically control, because when you're a Silicon Valley founder, you might own like 20 or 30% of the company. You might have 2 board seats, but that is not, full on control. But you could imagine a regulator or a lawmaker or an activist making an argument successfully that there was de facto control there. And, we've seen some court cases. We've also seen, efforts in Congress to rein this in. So I think it's totally an open question whether this will continue. The thing is, it's not just Peter Thiel. Lots of other people have used this structure. This would create a lot. This would lead to a lot of mad billionaires if it changed. And Peter Thiel would be one of them.
I've got another question coming in from the stream from a user named You Can't Unhear This, who's joining us again. Thank you for your question again. Says, how did you decide when to end the process of writing a biography of a living person? Did you have any questions you would like to have had that asked Thiel but didn't get the chance?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it is the book is not, it's not a biography in the sense that that Thiel's career is not over. It's maybe it's half over, maybe. And of course, I mean, I'm half joking, but Thiel wants to live forever. He's done all this research in life extension. Maybe it's only like a quarter of the way over. Maybe Thiel will live forever, and what I've just captured is just a tiny slice of his life. But I think I think it's important because Peter Thiel has a lot of power, and like I said, it's a political power, but it's also kind of an economic and cultural power. And I think it's really good to closely scrutinize these things, while they're happening, rather than just kind of waiting for history to decide, did Facebook or Google have a monopoly? Did Facebook, whatever? It's better to be to ask those questions now, when we can still potentially take action, or at least change our own thinking about it. So I think that's kind of the case for doing it now. And I think absolutely there will be an opportunity for more study of this guy, because I don't think he's done. I mean, I think he's like I said, I think he's still making moves. I think in some ways his power is growing. I mean, I thought a lot about the question of like, what would I want to ask him if if I could pin him down. And I think one thing is, he has expressed affinity in various ways and at various times for some very, very, very extreme ideas. And those ideas include sort of a skepticism toward democracy, skepticism toward capitalism, I guess, as we know it. Like he's advocated kind of a sort of a vision of capitalism as sort of a monopoly capitalism, and skepticism, frankly, to this, like this idea of a nation state or whatever. And like these are very very strong, very almost radical positions that that I think a lot of people, on both sides of the political spectrum might find a little bit scary, especially in somebody who has a lot of power. And he hasn't really answered those questions. He hasn't really said, well, do you actually, do you actually believe this stuff? Or are you just kind of doing a contrarian, thought experiment thing? And he's allowed that ambiguity to hang out there. And I assume he will continue to do so. But I think, pinning him down on some of these questions would be probably useful to us all as a society.
Mm-hmm. With that in mind, what do you want the biggest takeaway people get from this after reading this book to be?
I mean, the takeaway for me is that that there is just more power than people appreciate in Silicon Valley, and that, I mean, I think Thiel is a really interesting kind of case study in that, but he's not the beginning and the end of that. He's just I would argue the most important figure of it. And I think that scrutinizing and asking tough questions of these companies and of the people who run them is what we all need to be doing. Both, what I feel like is important to do as a journalist, but I think probably is something that citizens and politicians and everyone should be thinking about, at least.
Well, if you want to think about it more to our viewership at home, Max's book is The Contrarian, Peter Thiel and Silicon Valley's Pursuit of Power. Thank you, Max, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and sharing such great questions.
Thank you.
Take care.